Hello again, my friends, and welcome back to another episode on Episcopal Identity, where one priest, this guy, reflects on what it means to be Episcopalian. I acknowledge that there will be plenty of other people, clergy and non-clergy alike, who may disagree with some of my take on what it means to be Episcopalian, and that's kind of the beauty of being able to be Episcopalian, as we can agree to disagree on a whole host of issues and still be one. We're a pretty broad tradition when it comes to viewpoints and opinions on things. For this episode, I want to share with you something I tried to record last week, and I just had the hardest time getting words out for some reason. So I'm going to try it again. Here, let's see how it goes. So I ended up having a weird reflection on Henry VIII, which some people actually found to be quite helpful, which I'm glad. I figured people would just kind of roll their eyes at it because I was really struggling last week. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's just hard to wrap words around ideas, especially when you're tired. And I was quite tired last week. But anyhow, for this episode, I want to talk more about kind of the Episcopal, not just worldview, but how we Episcopalians kind of filter our ideology through our worldview. So it's not just what we think, but how we think. And in the past, I talked about the three-legged stool kind of approach that's really pretty famous, that most people know about. So when we think about what sources do we appeal to in order to kind of find our identity? We appeal to scripture, we appeal to reason, and we appeal to tradition. And there's another video that expounded that, right? I did what I could to expound it, at least. But there's another way of Episcopalian thinking that I think isn't named a whole lot and isn't really referenced a whole lot, and I have found it to be one of the most helpful, and I would even say liberating things that I've discovered since becoming an Episcopalian. So it's like a frame of reference, we'll call it that, the Episcopal frame of reference. And in fact, it really isn't Episcopalian. This frame of reference, this thing I'm trying to name, didn't originate in our tradition. It actually originated with a pretty well-known theologian by the name of Yaroslav Pelikan, who was a Lutheran minister. Well, maybe a Lutheran theologian. I can't remember if he was a minister or a theologian. He was a Lutheran for a long time, and then he became Eastern Orthodox. But at some point in his journey, he kind of developed this frame of reference that one helped people to kind of name their religious kind of priorities and the things they invest the most weight in. But it's also really remarkable in that if you can use it as a dialogue tool. You can use it to see how other people from other traditions think. And it's really great. And one of my professors in seminary actually introduced this to us in class. And I just found it to be, again, really helpful. And his take on it was, even though this Lutheran that became Orthodox guy was the one that kind of developed it, he believed that we Episcopalians have really embraced the spirit of it, even if we don't know anything about it. So this frame of reference, this lens through which we look at things, it's not just about the three-legged stool, but it's also about, there's three. If you can visualize it, I should have drawn this out for you all, but it is what it is. Too late. I'm already going now. But if you can visualize three circles, like a bullseye, so there's an inner circle, an outer circle, and then another layer that's an outer circle as well. So the way the thinking goes is that the inner circle is where we put dogma. So dogma is the kind of irrefutable, indispensable truth of a tradition. The next ring is doctrine, and most people don't distinguish between dogma and doctrine these days, but in this frame of reference we do, and I actually find this to be really helpful. So dogma, again, are those things that really you don't question, but they're just parts of the tradition that you just take as truths. They're just, if you threw them away, then you'd lose the essence of the thing you have, right? And doctrine is actually an expounding upon those truths. So just to give an example, we can say that Jesus died on a cross. That's an indispensable dogma. Like we believe it, we don't question it. Hardly anybody that I know, New Testament scholars, everybody, nobody questions that Jesus died. Everybody questions what it meant. Did it mean anything, right? So whenever you don't question the dogma that Jesus died, so that's dogma. But we do question the meaning of that dogma, and that gets into the territory of doctrine. So doctrine we can have a lot of diversity on and differing opinions on, and really should, because we're trying to get at the heart of the dogma, right? And so that's dogma is the inner circle, doctrine, the next circle out. The next circle out is tradition. So just kind of how we embody ritualistically and socially and liturgically the doctrine and the dogma. So it's like how you put flesh to the implications of the central tenets of the faith, right? So it's really helpful. You can make those distinctions, right? So you go from like the inner circle is the less fluid thing, right? The less malleable thing. But the further out you go, the more fluid, the more malleable, the more open to change these things can be. So tradition, liturgy changes all the time, right? We update our prayer books quite a bit. Even now we have our 79 prayer book, but we have updated resources that we could use to kind of modernize our liturgies, right? And doctrines, they don't change as frequently, I don't think, because there's kind of these traditions of thought, but they are also open to change. And a pretty central figure in our tradition, who eventually became Roman Catholic, but he was Anglican, or part of the Episcopal tradition, he talked about the development of doctrine. That doctrine is actually meant to be this thing that progressively changes and develops because God is infinite, and our knowledge of God is not inexhaustible, right? So the deeper we go through history, and the deeper we go into God, like there should be new insights and new developments in terms of doctrine. But dogma is just like the hard and fast truth, the thing you don't question. So the thing that's really beautiful about the Episcopal tradition is we have a pretty small circle, inner circle, for dogma. And there's even some debate in terms of what that is. So traditionally, historically, the kind of central thing, the thing that you unwaveringly devote yourself to and don't question, would be like the creeds, right? The Apostles' Creed and Nicene's Creed. Now, again, we're not talking about the meaning of the words of the creed. We're just saying that these creeds are stating a truth that we don't really question, right? But when it comes to unpacking what does it mean that Jesus really rose from the grave, then we're getting into the area of doctrine, for example, or what does it mean when we talk about the believing in the universal Catholic Church, or believing in God the Father. That then we're getting into the area of doctrine. So there could be divergent viewpoints even on the meaning of that. So traditionally, dogma has been the thing, like the creeds, that hasn't been questioned. In modern times, we've had some people actually say, yeah, maybe the creeds aren't so great after all. And so the scope is even getting more narrow. I don't have much of an opinion on that. I could see where people are coming from. I also don't get caught up on the creeds as much as some other people do. I don't see the creeds as being like the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed as exhausting all that there is to say about God and the Bible and Jesus, right? I see the creeds as an invitation to truth, but I understand where some other people feel like the creeds are a bit constraining and archaic, maybe even in their language. So I get it. I'm not fully there. I don't see them as being a problem. That's just me personally. So I don't have any problem keeping the creeds in the dogmatic center. And then when we ask about things like, what do we mean when we say Jesus rose from the dead? What is the meaning of Christ dying on the cross for our sins, right? According to the scriptures, what do these things mean? Then we're getting into the territory of doctrine. And then how do we live in light of all of that? Then we're getting into the area of tradition. So, but yeah, so having a pretty narrow, small center, as opposed to having like a massive like catechism. There's other traditions that have these really big catechisms that or several catechisms. The tradition I came out of, you had to subscribe to several catechisms in order to be in. Nobody really believed all of it, but the idea was you did, and you held unwaveringly to everything that these catechisms said. But I personally like having not much in the center, because it allows for diversity. It allows for more mystery, I think. We don't feel the need to kind of explain everything away, especially from an authoritative type of standpoint. So I can have people in my parish, for example, can have actually not just opposing viewpoints on certain issues, right? But they can even have an opposing viewpoint from me, right? They don't have to agree with everything the priest says. And I think I find that to be a really freeing thing, and I'm sure people in the parish do too. So yeah, the other part of this whole frame of reference, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that it's also really helpful when you're dialoguing, especially with somebody outside of your tradition, who's from another denomination, for example, because you can try to figure out what's at the center for them. And when you realize what's at the center for them may not be what's at the center for you, that's an important thing to understand, because if you don't, you're going to be kind of talking past each other. So what is it that you hold to dogmatically? What is it that you hold to doctrinally, that you allow for some fluidity and some development? What is it that you hold to traditionally, and what do they hold as the dogmatic center to their belief system, right? What do they see as being flexible and malleable, right? So it's really helpful. And I think especially these days, something I find as an Episcopal priest, not just even as a priest, I found this before I became an Episcopalian, but this has given me a way of naming it in such a wonderful and helpful way, is that a lot of manifestations of Christianity these days, especially those that are more kind of like fundamentalistic, have kind of, they may have like traditional creedal type of dogmatic things at the center. A lot of times they don't actually. So you don't have to believe in the Trinity in order to be in for them, right? Or you don't have to believe in certain aspects of historic Christian faith in order to be in. But the thing you have to believe in is their ethical viewpoint, their ethical standards. And they've dogmaticized ethics, where ethics in the past usually would have been in the realm of like somewhere between like the doctrine circle and the tradition circle, right? Because ethics is always this kind of constantly developing thing. But for many flavors of Christianity, their ethical view is not something that can be developed or questioned or challenged. It's dogmatic for them. It's a dogma. So if you do not align yourself with their dogmatic ethical understanding, they're going to see you as not only being an outsider, but even being somebody who is opposed to what is most central to their faith and their worldview. And knowing that going into it is helpful. So, because, and many times, hopefully some dialogue could be had, but we tend to not want to be terribly generous with those things that we hold dogmatically to, right? And so if there's a lot of things at the dogmatic center for somebody, the conversation often gets less generous because there's a lot of things that they subscribe to and hold to and believe that everybody should subscribe to and hold to, right? And they're pretty fierce. They can be fierce about that. And if you're not as adamant about it as they are, that could be problematic for the sake of having a conversation or even fellowship or a relationship, right? So yeah, that's helpful. So it's helpful to have some self-awareness of like, what do you put at the center? What is your dogma in terms of your faith? What thing do you not question at all? What things do you allow for some wiggle room to develop, right, as you think through the implications of the thing that you hold to unquestionably? And then, the wider circle, how does that affect your prayer life, your worship life, and how you embody it? So it's a good practice to think about, not just on a wider traditional Episcopal church scale, but individually as well. And especially as you engage with other people, what do they hold to the center? What is unquestionable for them? What can be shifted and changed and developed over time, if anything? I think there are some Christian traditions where they pretty much got it all figured out. And there's no room for development or questions or change allowed, right? Other than maybe the style of worship or the style of music, right? Maybe worship can be modernized and changed and developed. We can go from just singing hymns to having like a praise band. With the ministers can go from suits and ties to having skinny jeans and V-necks as vestments. Forgive me on that one, but yeah. One of my mottos in life is never trust a minister in a tie. Trust even less a minister in skinny jeans and a V-neck who believes that is an appropriate vestment. But I digress. Anyways, yes. So it's just good to know what people hold to dogmatically and what you yourself hold to dogmatically. And it's good to know what is the dogmatic center of the tradition you're a part of, like the creeds for us Episcopalians, and that's pretty much it. We have a catechism, but it's not something that's binding. You don't have to believe the catechism in order to be an Episcopalian. We don't look at it that way. But it is helpful for you to think about, like, what is the dogmatic center of my tradition and what's my dogmatic center, and is there a divergence there? And if so, why? Right? So anyhow, hopefully that's helpful. Yeah. I'm glad I finally kind of got the words out this week, because I struggled last week. I think I was trying to do this thing where I'm like videoing myself with one hand and trying to do circles with the other hand. It just was not working, y'all. It just didn't work. But this week it kind of worked. So yeah. Anyhow, another frame of reference in terms of what it means to think Episcopalianly. Peace. Thank you for tuning in, as always.